The note was still in her hand when Margaret Sutton's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She had read it 3 times already, standing in the doorway of the small, weathered farmhouse that had become her prison and her refuge all at once, and each time the words hit her differently. Not a demand, not a threat, not the kind of language she had grown accustomed to hearing from men who thought they owned something simply because the deed bore their name. The handwriting was plain and deliberate, the letters pressed into the paper with the quiet confidence of a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chose his wood for strength, not decoration. The well is fixed. The gate swings true. And I ask for nothing. That was it. No signature, no flourish, no expectation coiled like a rattlesnake between the lines. Margaret pressed her back against the doorframe and stared out across the land that was technically hers now, though it felt about as familiar as the surface of the moon. The Kansas Territory stretched out before her in the late afternoon light of September 1873, golden and vast and indifferent to everything she had survived to get here. The dry grass rippled in waves. A hawk circled lazily above the cottonwood trees that marked the creek line. And at the far edge of the property, just visible beyond a low rise, she could see the neat fence line she had not noticed before, the gate set square and true in its posts, the hinges no longer sagging the way they had been when she arrived 3 weeks ago. He had done it without being asked. That was the thing that undid her, not the kindness itself, though that was almost more than she could bear. It was the silence in which it had been performed. No announcement. No standing on her porch waiting for gratitude. Just the work done, clean and honest, and a note left to tell her so. A note that asked for nothing in return. Margaret Sutton had not met a man who asked for nothing in a very long time. She was not entirely sure she believed such men existed. She had believed once in the honest weight of a handshake, in the sacred reliability of a promise. And then she had married Gerald Sutton, and that belief had been dismantled piece by piece over 7 years, until there was nothing left of it but a kind of hollow caution that she carried with her everywhere, a dark past she wore like a second skin. Gerald was dead now. 6 months in the ground, buried in the stiff Missouri clay she had fled as soon as the estate was settled. She had not wept at his grave. She had stood there in the cold March wind and felt nothing except a vast, exhausted relief that frightened her more than grief would have. The relief felt like its own kind of betrayal of the girl she had been when she married him, of the hope she had dragged into that union like a bride dragging the hem of her dress through mud. She had come to Kansas because the land was cheap, and the past could not follow her quite so easily across the open prairie. She had come because her cousin Eliza had written to her and said the country out here was honest, whatever that meant, and that a woman with a bit of grit and a clean deed could make something of herself without needing anyone's permission. Margaret had believed her, or she had wanted to badly enough that the distinction stopped mattering. What she had not expected was Benjamin Chandler. She had first seen him on the day she arrived, standing in the yard of the adjacent property with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, repairing a section of fence with the concentrated patience of a man who had done it 100 times and intended to do it 100 more. He was tall and lean, weathered by the sun the way all the men out here were, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and hands that were permanently stained with the honest evidence of labor. He had looked up when her wagon came down the road, and he had watched her for exactly 1 moment, not leering, not appraising, just observing, the way a man checks the sky before he decides what the day will bring. Then he had gone back to his fence. He had not come over to introduce himself. He had not offered to help unload her things. He had simply continued his work, and Margaret had found herself oddly grateful for it, because every other man she had passed through in the last 3 weeks had been full of loud, eager helpfulness that felt like its own kind of ownership. She had learned his name from old Mrs. Dempsey at the general store in the nearby town of Harlan's Creek, which was barely a town at all, a post office, a livery, a dry goods store, and a saloon that doubled as the nearest thing to a courthouse when the circuit judge was away. Benjamin Chandler, Mrs. Dempsey had said, with the particular warmth of a woman who had known someone their entire life. Quiet man. Good man. Lost his wife to fever 3 years ago. Runs about 400 acres, mostly cattle. Does not bother anyone and does not tolerate being bothered. Has a little boy named Thomas, 7 years old, sharp as a tack. Margaret had filed all of that away with the careful attention she gave to everything she learned about her new world, trying to map its contours, its loyalties, its hidden dangers. She was not looking for another man to trust. She was looking for somewhere safe to exist. And then she had come home one morning from town to find her well had been making a terrible grinding sound. The rope frayed through on one side, and she had spent the better part of 2 days trying to figure out how to fix it with her modest knowledge of such things and the slim resources available to her. She had been out there on her knees in the dust, her hands bleeding slightly where the rough rope had cut her, when she had heard the squeak of her gate and looked up to find Thomas Chandler standing there at the edge of her property, staring at her with enormous brown eyes. "Your well rope is frayed wrong," the boy had said, with complete matter-of-fact confidence. "I know," Margaret had replied. "My pa could fix it." "I am sure he could," Margaret had said carefully. The boy had stared at her for another moment, then turned and walked back through the gate, and that had been the end of it. Margaret had returned to her wrestling with the rope, and by evening she had managed a jury-rigged solution that worked after a fashion, though the grinding sound remained. That had been 5 days ago. This morning she had woken to the sound of something that was most decidedly not grinding, had looked out her window, and found the well operating with the smooth efficiency of something newly repaired. The gate, which she had barely registered as having a problem because there were so many other problems demanding her attention, was standing square and steady in its frame, its hinges clearly replaced, the latch working with a clean, satisfying click. And on the well's wooden housing, tucked under a stone to keep it from blowing away, she had found the note. "The well is fixed. The gate swings true, and I ask for nothing." Margaret folded the note carefully and placed it in the small cedar box she kept on the windowsill, where she kept the few letters from Eliza and the dried lavender from her mother's garden in Missouri, all the small anchors that kept her tethered to the possibility of kindness in the world. She stood at the window for a long moment and looked out toward the rise that separated her property from Benjamin Chandler's. Then she did something she had not done voluntarily in a very long time. She went to her kitchen, checked the state of her pantry with military efficiency, and began to bake a pie. It was not, she told herself firmly as she rolled out the crust, a romantic gesture. It was a reasonable response to an act of neighborly generosity. A woman of manners, which she intended to remain even out here at the edge of the civilized world, did not accept a favor without acknowledging it. That was all this was. A simple transaction of courtesy. She told herself that all the way up the long road to the Chandler property, carrying the pie carefully in both hands and trying not to think too hard about the strange way her heart had been knocking around in her chest ever since she read that note. The Chandler property was more established than hers, which made sense given that he had been here for years, while she had arrived only 3 weeks ago. The house was solid and well-maintained, unpretentious but clearly built to last, a 2-story structure of native limestone that turned amber in the afternoon light. There was a large barn, its red paint faded to a warm rust, and several smaller outbuildings. Chickens moved through the yard with their customary air of barely managed chaos. A dog of indeterminate breed lifted its head from the porch and regarded Margaret with profound suspicion. Benjamin Chandler was at the horse trough, washing his face and hands with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been working hard and was not yet done. He heard her footsteps on the gravel path and straightened, turning toward her, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the quiet afternoon. "Mr. Chandler," Margaret said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Sutton," he replied. He reached for the cloth hanging on the trough's edge and dried his hands without taking his eyes off her. He had dark eyes, she noticed, the deep brown of creek water in shadow. He was perhaps 35, she estimated, though the sun out here aged everyone and he might have been younger. "You fixed my well," she said. "And the gate," he said, without any particular emphasis. "And the gate," she agreed. "I brought you a pie." He looked at the pie. Then he looked at her. There was something in his expression she could not entirely read, not quite amusement, not quite seriousness. Something in between, a watchful quality, like he was listening for something beyond the words. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You did not have to fix my well," she replied. A beat of silence passed between them, and then the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, in what might have been the beginning of a smile that he had thought better of. "Thomas said you were struggling with it," he said. "Thomas was correct," she said. "He tends to be," Benjamin said, and there was something so plainly genuine in the way he said it, such uncomplicated pride in his voice for his son, that Margaret felt something shift in her chest. It was small, barely perceptible, like the first inch of movement in something that had been frozen for a very long time. She extended the pie. He took it. "Apple," she said. "From the tree on my east side. I hope you like apple." "I do," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton." "Margaret," she said before she had quite decided to, "please." He looked at her for a moment. "Benjamin," he said. She nodded once, like a decision had been ratified, and turned to walk back down the road. She heard him behind her, quiet as always, not calling after her, not making it into anything more than it was. When she reached the bend in the road and glanced back, he was still standing there holding the pie, watching her go with that same unhurried attention he had given her on the first day, when she had come down the road in her wagon and he had simply looked and then returned to his work. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the lamp burning low and thought about hidden motives. She had spent 7 years learning to identify them. Gerald had been a man constructed almost entirely of hidden motives, a man whose surface charm had concealed a systematic need to control everything within his reach, and Margaret had been the nearest and most accessible thing to control. She had learned, through a long and painful education, that when a man offered something freely, it was generally because he believed he would extract more in return than whatever he was giving. She picked up the note from her cedar box and read it again. "The well is fixed. The gate swings true, and I ask for nothing." She put it down. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the Kansas night, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant complaint of coyotes, the settling of the house itself around her, and she tried very hard not to feel hopeful about anything. She was not entirely successful. The following Saturday was the first social occasion Margaret had attended since arriving in Harlan's Creek, a gathering at the Dempsey farm, which old Mrs. Dempsey and her husband held at the start of each month for the loose community of homesteaders and ranchers spread across the surrounding miles. It was the kind of event that served multiple purposes in a country where the nearest town was an hour's ride. News was exchanged, disputes were aired and sometimes settled, goods and skills were traded, and the simple human fact of being in the same place at the same time did the invisible work of maintaining the social fabric of a frontier community. Margaret dressed carefully, not because she wished to impress anyone, but because her dignity was one of the few things Gerald had not been able to take from her, and she intended to keep it. She wore her good gray wool and pinned her dark hair up with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. She hitched her horse to the wagon and drove the 4 miles to the Dempsey place with her back straight and her chin level, and her hands steady on the reins. Benjamin Chandler was there with Thomas, who immediately abandoned his father to chase the other children through the yard, with the boundless energy of a boy who spent most of his days in the solitary company of adults. Benjamin was standing with a group of men near the barn, talking with the calm, deliberate manner that Margaret had already come to recognize as characteristic of him. He was not the loudest man in the group. He was the one the others seemed to angle themselves toward, the way creek water finds the deepest channel. He saw her arrive. He nodded. She nodded back. That was all, and somehow it was enough to occupy a significant portion of her thoughts for the next 20 minutes while she went through the necessary rituals of introduction and reintroduction with the women of the community. There was Hattie Reeves, whose husband ran the dry goods store and who radiated the decisive efficiency of a woman who had organized everything within a 20-mile radius and expected it to stay organized. There was young Clara Voss, recently arrived from Ohio with her husband Eric, who was pregnant with her first child and radiantly terrified about it in equal measure. There was Ruth Baines, a widow like Margaret, though Ruth's widowhood was of the more socially conventional grieving variety, and she spoke of her late husband with a warmth that Margaret both admired and found vaguely alien. "You have taken the old Harrington place," Hattie said, not as a question. She was a woman of facts. "I have," Margaret said. "It needs considerable work," Hattie said. "Yes," Margaret agreed, "though I am finding it manageable." "Benjamin Chandler fixed your well," Hattie said. It was not quite a question, and not quite an observation. It sat in the air between them with a particular feminine weight that Margaret recognized immediately. "He was kind enough to do so, yes," Margaret said, meeting Hattie's gaze with the directness she had cultivated as a defense against women who mistook reticence for weakness. Hattie studied her for a moment, then smiled. "He is a good man," she said, in a tone that contained volumes. "Has been since he arrived here 9 years ago. Did not say much then either, just worked. Built that place from nothing but rock and stubbornness." She paused. "He has not paid particular notice to anyone since losing Caroline. 3 years now." "I appreciate knowing the community," Margaret said, which was not precisely a response to what Hattie had said, but served adequately. Hattie's smile widened slightly, as if she appreciated the deflection but was not entirely deterred by it. The afternoon wore on pleasantly enough. There was food, the kind of generous, practical abundance that people who lived close to scarcity produced on the occasions when they had cause to celebrate. And there was music provided by old Pete Calloway on his fiddle. And there was the particular quality of light that late September produced in Kansas, warm and slightly nostalgic, like the sun itself, was aware of what was coming and trying to leave a good impression. Margaret was helping to carry dishes inside when she found herself suddenly level with Benjamin Chandler in the narrow doorway of the Dempsey kitchen, both of them navigating the same domestic moment from opposite directions, and there was a brief collision of social gravity that stopped them both. "Excuse me," she said. "My fault," he said. They stood for a moment, closer than they had been before, and Margaret was very conscious of the solidity of him, the kind of physical presence that was not aggressive but was undeniably there. "How are you finding the territory?" he asked. It was a simple question, but he asked it with the particular quality of attention that made her feel he was actually interested in the answer. "Large," she said, "and honest, as advertised." That produced the almost smile again. "Advertised by whom?" "My cousin Eliza. She says the land out here is honest." "The land is honest," he said. "It does exactly what it means to do. Good year or bad year, it tells you straight." "I appreciate that," Margaret said. After a period of less straightforward circumstances, it was more than she had intended to say. She felt it immediately, the slight vulnerability of the admission, and she saw him notice it. His expression shifted just barely into something careful and considerate. "Well," he said, "Harlan's Creek is generally what it appears to be. The people are mostly fair." He paused. "Mostly, and the exceptions?" she asked. "There are 1 or 2, he said. "I will mention it if it becomes relevant." "Thank you," she said, "for that and for the well." "The well needed fixing," he said simply. "Many things needed fixing," she said. "You chose that one." "Thomas chose that one," he said with quiet candor. "He told me it was the most urgent. He has good instincts." Margaret looked past Benjamin toward where Thomas was visible through the window, a slight, serious-faced boy who was currently engaged in what appeared to be a very earnest debate with 2 other children about some matter of great importance. "He seems like a remarkable child," she said. Benjamin watched his son with an expression that was so openly, unguardedly loving that Margaret had to look away. "He is," he said. He is everything his mother was, and a few things I cannot account for." A small silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. "I am sorry for your loss," Margaret said. "Mrs. Dempsey mentioned your wife." "Caroline," he said. Her name in his mouth was a complete thing, not a wound but a finished fact, something he had lived with long enough to hold without flinching. "Fever. Thomas was 4. She would have liked you, I think." The simplicity of that landed on Margaret in a way she had not expected. She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "You do not apologize for yourself," he said. Then he seemed to catch himself, as if he had said more than he had intended, which Margaret found somehow reassuring. He was not smooth. He was not performing. He was a man who spoke carefully and occasionally, without calculation, said something true. "I learned the price of that," she said quietly. He looked at her, and she had the sense that he understood exactly what she meant without requiring further explanation, that he possessed the particular intelligence of someone who paid close attention to what people said, and more crucially, to what they did not. She began. "Of course," he said, and stepped back to let her through the doorway. The gathering wound down as the light shifted toward evening, and people began the long drives back to their distant properties. Thomas fell asleep in the back of his father's wagon before they had even left the Dempsey yard, curled up under a horse blanket with the complete surrender of a child who had spent every ounce of available energy. Benjamin tucked the blanket more securely around the boy's shoulders, and that small gesture, unhurried, automatic, utterly tender, was the last thing Margaret saw before she turned her wagon toward home. She thought about it for a long time that night. October arrived with the particular decisiveness of a Kansas autumn, the temperatures dropping sharply after sunset, and the sky taking on a quality of blue so deep and clear it seemed almost aggressive. Margaret threw herself into the work of the place with the disciplined energy of someone who understood that winter was not a metaphor. The root cellar needed stocking, the barn needed winterizing, the gap in the north wall of the house needed addressing before the real cold came. She worked until her hands were rough and her shoulders ached, and she fell into bed each night with the clean, uncomplicated exhaustion of physical labor, which was better than the restless, circular insomnia she had endured in Missouri during the last years of her marriage. She did not see Benjamin Chandler often. He was a busy man with a cattle operation that made heavy demands on his time in the fall. But she was aware of him in the way that you become aware of the particular sound of someone's footsteps on a staircase, something you might not have noticed at first, but which, once registered, is distinctly and recognizably itself. Once she saw him at the top of the rise on horseback, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, clearly running cattle from one pasture to another. Once Thomas appeared at her gate with a basket containing 2 jars of preserved peaches and a short note, this one in a child's careful handwriting. "Pa said to give you these because we have too many. From Thomas Chandler." Margaret sent back half a loaf of cornbread and 3 jars of apple butter. Once, in the middle of a particular night when the wind had come up fierce and something had gone wrong with the north barn door, she had struggled for nearly an hour with it in the dark and the cold, and in the morning she had found hoof prints in the mud beside her fence line and a new brace nail set cleanly into the barn door's bottom hinge. He had heard the wind. He had known what it meant. He had come and done the necessary thing and gone without waking her. She stood there in the cold morning air looking at that nail for a long time. It was not the gesture of a man with a hidden agenda. She had been so thoroughly educated in hidden agendas that she was fairly certain she could identify one at 100 yards. This was something else entirely. Something so stripped of strategy or expectation that it made her chest ache with a feeling she could not immediately name. She named it eventually, somewhere around the 3rd week of October, while she was splitting wood in the clean morning air and working through the problem the way she worked through all problems, methodically, without hurrying. She had been afraid of it, which was why she had been circumventing its name. The feeling was trust, a thin, early morning tendril of it, barely formed, easily broken, but there. She had not trusted anyone, not in that unguarded way, in a very long time. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Harlan Breck. Breck ran a small but aggressive cattle operation about 8 miles north of her property, and he had been, from all she could gather from the careful warnings of Hattie Reeves and the more blunt assessment of the livery keeper, a persistent source of difficulty for several of the smaller homesteaders in the area. He was the kind of man who understood the mechanics of legal intimidation, not violent, or not obviously so, but skilled in the use of formal structures to accomplish informal ends. He had acquired 3 properties in the last 2 years through what Hattie described, with studied neutrality, as favorable circumstances for the buyer. He arrived at Margaret's property on a Tuesday morning in late October, riding up to her door with a companion she did not recognize, and the air of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. He was perhaps 50, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had settled into the permanent lines of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He wore his authority the way some men wore their best coats, consciously, for effect. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, not getting down from his horse, "I have heard you are finding the place somewhat difficult to manage." "You have heard incorrectly," Margaret said. She was standing on her porch. She did not come down the steps. Breck looked around the property with a slow, proprietary survey that made her skin tighten. "I have an interest in acquiring land in this area," he said. "I would be prepared to make you a fair offer. Given that a woman alone, I am not interested in selling," Margaret said. "You have not heard my offer," Breck said. "I do not need to," she said. "The property is not for sale." Breck looked at her for a long moment, reassessing. The reassessment was not pleasant to watch. She could see the mechanism of it working behind his eyes, the shift from the assumption that she would be manageable to the recognition that she was not going to be, and the consequent recalibration toward something harder. "I understand the water rights on this property are somewhat contested," he said. His tone had not changed, but the content of it had become something different. "There may be legal complications regarding the deed's provisions as regards the creek access. It might be worth your while to consult with me before those complications arise." There it was. Margaret had been waiting for it from the moment she saw him ride up, that particular shape of threat dressed in the language of helpful advice, secrets and traps wrapped in the vocabulary of concern. "If there are legal questions regarding the property," she said, "I will consult with the appropriate legal authorities." "The nearest circuit judge is in Salina," Breck said. "That is a considerable distance for a woman managing alone." "I am capable of the distance," Margaret said. Breck looked at her for another moment, then looked past her at the house, and she could see him measuring something, calculating. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing with himself on something she was not privy to. "Good day to you, Mrs. Sutton," he said, and turned his horse and rode back down the road with his companion. Margaret stood on her porch until they were out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down at her kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of being afraid. She did not waste the 5 minutes. She used them to think very clearly about what she knew, what she did not know, and what she needed to find out. At the end of the 5 minutes, she stood up, put on her coat, and went to find Benjamin Chandler. She found him in his barn, examining the hoof of one of his horses with focused concentration. He looked up when she came through the barn door, read something in her face, and set the horse's foot down carefully. "Breck came to see you," he said. It was not a question. She stopped. "How did you know?" His horse passed on the road. He straightened and turned to face her fully. "What did he say?" She told him. Precisely, without embellishment, the way she had learned to report difficult things, the complete facts and nothing but in order of occurrence. Benjamin listened without interrupting, with the quality of attention she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, the kind that made you feel heard in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with being genuinely, carefully understood. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The water rights on your property are not contested. The deed from the territory office is clean. I checked it at the land office in Salina when you first arrived." Margaret stared at him, "You checked my deed." Something moved through his expression. "I knew Breck had been watching the property," he said. "I wanted to be certain the paperwork was sound before he had cause to create a reason it was not." The import of this landed on her slowly, the way large things do when your mind needs a moment to accommodate their size. He had gone to Selena, a full day's ride before she had even met him, in order to verify that she had legal footing without telling her he was doing it, without asking anything for it. "You did that before we had even spoken," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man choosing his words the way he always did, for accuracy, not impression. "Because a woman alone on that property was going to be a target for Breck," he said. "And because if the paperwork was compromised, it would be better to know early." "And if it had been compromised?" she asked. "Then I would have told you," he said, "and we would have dealt with it." The word sat in the air between them. Margaret let it sit there. "What does he actually want with my property?" she asked. "Creek access," Benjamin said. "He has been trying to control the water rights on this stretch of the creek for 2 years. Your land and mine sit between him and what he wants. He has been picking off the smaller properties one at a time." He paused. "He tried to buy mine 6 months ago. I declined. And since then, he has been patient," Benjamin said. "He is a patient man. That is what makes him dangerous. More dangerous than an impatient one. Usually," he said, "impatient men make mistakes. Patient men plan." Margaret thought about this. "What do you suggest?" he considered. "Go to Selena," he said. "Register a certified copy of your deed with the county clerk and get a written notation of the water rights provisions. It creates a public record that is harder to quietly challenge." He paused. "I can accompany you if you would find that useful. I have business at the land office anyway." She studied him. "Do you?" The corner of his mouth moved. "I might develop some." Despite everything, the lingering tension of Breck's visit, the cold anger that had been sitting in her chest since she left her own porch, Margaret felt something soften. "All right," she said. "Saturday, if that suits." "Saturday," he said. They rode to Selena on a Saturday morning that was cold and brilliantly clear, the kind of Kansas day that felt like the world had been remade overnight, and everything in it was precise and definite and lit from within. Margaret drove her wagon and Benjamin rode alongside on his horse, and Thomas came along in the back of the wagon, because there was no one to leave him with, and he was, in any case, the kind of child who was more useful for being included than for being excluded. Thomas sat in the back of the wagon wrapped in a quilt and ate an apple and asked questions with the relentless systematic curiosity of a boy who had decided that the world was an enormous puzzle, and he intended to solve it. "Why do water rights matter?" he asked at some point around the 3rd mile. "Because water is what makes the land live," Margaret said. "Without water access, land is just dirt." Thomas considered this. "And Breck wants to control the water. He wants to control who has access to it," she said. "So he can make people depend on him," Thomas said. It was so precisely correct that Margaret glanced over her shoulder at the boy and found him looking at her with his father's eyes, that dark, quietly measuring gaze. "Exactly," she said. "That is a trap," Thomas said. "It is," she said. "Pa does not set traps," Thomas said, with the simple authority of a child reporting an established fact. "He says traps are for men who cannot compete fairly." Margaret kept her eyes on the road, but she was aware of Benjamin slightly adjusting his position in the saddle beside her, as if he were mildly embarrassed by his son's candor. She managed not to smile. Selena was a proper town by Kansas Territory standards in 1873. A main street with 2 hotels, several mercantiles, a bank, a newspaper office, and the county courthouse that housed the land records office. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and the town had the particular energy of a place that was growing faster than it could quite organize itself. The business at the land office was straightforward, taking perhaps 40 minutes in total. Margaret presented her deed, the clerk examined it and confirmed its validity, and the certified copy was duly registered, with a notation of the water rights provisions laid out clearly and unambiguously, in the territory's standard deed format for that land parcel. It was, as legal proceedings went, entirely undramatic, but Margaret walked out of the courthouse with the solid, physical weight of the certified documents in her hands and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was tight. Benjamin was waiting outside with Thomas, who was earnestly engaged in questioning a man who had just brought in 2 horses for the livery. Benjamin took one look at Margaret's face and understood everything without her having to say it. "Good?" he asked. "Very good," she said. Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Can we get something to eat now?" he asked. "I have been very patient." "You have been asking questions continuously for 2 hours," his father said. "That is not mutually exclusive with being patient," Thomas said. Margaret laughed. It came out of her suddenly and completely, without warning, the way genuine laughter often does, and she clapped a hand over her mouth as if to catch it, but it was already there, bright and real in the cold autumn air of Selena's Main Street. Benjamin looked at her with an expression that was open and undefended, and she saw in his face something she had not seen in a man's face for so long that she had almost forgotten what it looked like. Simple, uncalculating pleasure at her happiness. They ate at a small restaurant near the hotel, proper beef stew and fresh bread and coffee that was strong enough to serve as structural material. Thomas consumed everything placed in front of him with the businesslike efficiency of a growing child, and then spent the meal telling Margaret about the horses he had observed at the livery, what he thought about their various qualities, and his considered opinion that the brown one with the white blaze was the best of the lot based on several pieces of evidence he outlined in systematic detail. Benjamin listened to his son and looked at Margaret and said very little, but he was present in the way of someone paying close attention to something that mattered to him, and Margaret was very conscious of the warmth of the small restaurant around them, the 3 of them at a table that felt, in some particular way that she did not allow herself to examine too closely, entirely natural. On the way home, Thomas fell asleep in the back of the wagon as reliably as a clock. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon, painting the grassland in long amber light. Margaret held the reins and thought about things she had not allowed herself to think about before. "He asked me," she said eventually, "what I thought about the brown horse with the blaze." "What did you think?" Benjamin asked, riding alongside. "That it had honest eyes," she said. He looked at her. "Horses with honest eyes," he said, "are horses without secrets." "Are there horses with secrets?" "Occasionally," he said. "You can usually tell in the first 5 minutes." "The same is probably true of people," she said. A pause. "Probably," he said. "You do not have secrets," she said. It came out as more of a statement than she had quite intended, though she stood by it. He was quiet for a moment. "I have things I do not talk about often," he said carefully. "That is different from secrets." "Yes," she said. "I know the difference." Another pause. The wagon wheels turned steadily on the rutted road. "Your husband," he said. It was not a question, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement, a door he was leaving ajar. "He was not honest," she said, "in the ways that matter. He was skilled at the surface of things." She kept her eyes on the road. "I was young and I wanted to believe the surface was the whole of it. I spent 7 years learning otherwise." "I am sorry," he said. "I am not," she said. "I am out here, which is where I would choose to be. I understand things now that I did not understand before, and some of that knowledge cost more than it should have, but I have it." She paused. "I am not broken by it." "No," he said, and his voice had something in it, a quality she could only describe as respect. "You are not." They drove in silence for a while, but it was the good kind of silence, the kind that does not require filling. "Caroline was ill for most of the last year of her life," he said eventually, without particular preamble, as if continuing a conversation they had been having inside their respective heads, and he had decided to bring it into the open air. "Fever came and went. There were times we thought she had beaten it, and then it would come back worse. Thomas was too young to fully understand and not too young to feel everything. I kept the place running and tried to make it normal for him, and some days that was the only thing I knew how to do." He paused. "When she died, I did not fall apart. I do not know if that was strength or just the absence of any available alternative. I have never been sure. You were taking care of your son, Margaret said. That is its own answer. He looked at her. Yes, he said quietly, I suppose it is. November came in on a cold, honest wind that swept the last of the leaves from the cottonwoods and left the land bare and clear and magnificent in its austerity. Margaret spent 3 weeks in the sustained hard work of winterizing, banking the foundation of the house with straw bales, laying in the root cellar, splitting and stacking what felt like a geological quantity of wood. She worked alongside Benjamin on 2 occasions when the work was simply too large for one person, once bringing in the last of her small hay supply before a predicted hard frost, and once when a section of her north fence came down in a wind and needed replacing before her 2 horses got out onto open range. Both times Benjamin simply appeared at the moment the work required another pair of hands, performed the work, and departed. There was no ceremony to it. It had become, somewhere in the turning of the season, simply the way things were between them, a natural rhythm of mutual aid that felt as organic as the movement of weather. But there was more to it than that, and they both knew it, and neither of them had yet said so. Margaret knew what she felt. She had been cataloging it with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything, and what she felt was this. When she heard the sound of his horse on the road, she felt a warmth that started in her chest and moved outward. When she did not see him for several days running, she was aware of his absence as a specific texture in the air. When he looked at her with those dark, attentive eyes, she felt seen in a way that she had not felt seen in so long that the sensation was almost disorienting, like stepping into bright sunlight from a dark room. She was afraid of all of it. The fear was not irrational. It was informed by hard experience, specific and legitimate. She had trusted the feeling before, and the feeling had been badly wrong. She could not simply decide that this time was different because she wanted it to be. The wanting was precisely what made it dangerous. And yet, the crisis with Breck deepened in November, which she had not entirely anticipated, having hoped that the trip to Selena and the certified documents would cool his interest. What she had not fully accounted for was that Breck was a patient man, as Benjamin had said, and patience in a man of his type was not a passive quality. It was a planning quality. What he did was this. He quietly began a process of buying up what he could not compel, and what he could not buy he attempted to undermine through the social and economic networks of the community. Small things, individually explicable, a missing supply order that left Margaret without feed she had paid for, a rumor that her water was fouled and not safe for livestock, questions raised at the monthly gathering at the Dempseys about the validity of certain deed provisions. None of it was enough to constitute a clear legal harm. All of it together was a slow strangulation, designed to make the property unworkable and the isolation untenable. Margaret noticed all of it. She noted it carefully. She did not panic, and she began planning in return. She wrote to her cousin Eliza, who had married a lawyer in Lawrence and who had, on several previous occasions, demonstrated a highly satisfying willingness to deploy legal expertise in the service of just causes. She wrote a careful, detailed letter describing the situation, the documented deed, the nature of Breck's approach, and the specific instances of commercial interference she had tracked. She asked for advice and, if appropriate, representation. She told Benjamin what she was doing. He sat across her kitchen table, the first time he had been inside her house, and read her draft letter with the focused concentration he brought to all things. Thomas was with a neighboring family for the afternoon. Outside, November was conducting its business with characteristic lack of sentimentality. Benjamin looked up from the letter. "This is thorough," he said. "I have been building the file for 3 weeks," she said. "Your cousin's husband, what is his practice?" "Land and contract disputes," she said. "He has worked cases in territorial court before." Benjamin nodded. He turned the letter over and looked at the back, then set it on the table between them. "There is one more thing," he said. Breck has been making inquiries about your deed from a different angle. He found a surveying error in the original land grant minor, the kind of thing that happens in hasty surveys, and he is suggesting to anyone who will listen that it creates an ambiguity about the eastern boundary. Margaret felt the familiar cold settling in her chest. Is the ambiguity legitimate? Technically it exists, Benjamin said. Practically it is irrelevant. But legally, in the right court with the right judge, it could be used to delay or cloud a title. He paused. I spoke to Tom Aldrich in Salina. He is the county surveyor. He has agreed to do a formal survey of your property and file it with the land office. It will cost $7, which I have already paid. Margaret stared at him. You paid for a survey of my land. He met her gaze steadily. I will take it in apple pie if it troubles you, he said. And there it was again, that quality, that exact quality of quiet, unhurried care that had no angle in it, no trap, no hidden agenda, just a man who had seen a problem and addressed it and was entirely at ease with having done so. Margaret felt something inside her, the last careful lock on the last careful door, give way. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she felt the movement of it, the shift of weight in her chest, and she held his gaze and said, Benjamin. Yes, he said, just that. As if the one word contained all the things she might have said next, and all the things he might have said in answer, and it was sufficient. The survey was completed in the 3rd week of November, and it confirmed everything the original deed had stated, with the surveying error corrected and documented and filed with the county office. Eliza's husband wrote back within the week. Lawyers were faster when family was involved. Margaret had learned with a measured legal opinion that was nonetheless devastating to Breck's potential case. He identified 3 specific instances of commercial interference that met the threshold for tortious interference, noted that the deed was unimpeachably sound, and indicated his availability to appear at any legal proceeding that might become necessary. Margaret made 2 copies of the letter, deposited one with the county clerk in Salina, and delivered the other in person to Harlan Breck's property with a message relayed through his ranch foreman that she was available to discuss the withdrawal of his claims at his convenience. She told Benjamin about it afterward. You went to Breck's property alone, he said. He was not reprimanding her. He was processing information. I was not in danger, she said. He is not a violent man, he is a legal one. There is a difference, he agreed. And I did not go inside, she said. I delivered the letter to the foreman at the gate. She paused. I was clear, I think. I expect you were, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite admiration, but was something in that neighborhood, something warm and solid that she had stopped trying to deflect. Breck withdrew his informal claims within the week. He sent no communication to Margaret directly. He simply stopped. The missing supply order was resolved. The rumors about her water ceased. The questions about her deed provisions were not raised at the next Dempsey gathering. It was not a defeat so much as an acknowledgement that the calculation had changed. Margaret did not expect the problem to have entirely disappeared, but she had established clearly enough that she was neither isolated nor undefended, and for a man like Breck, that was sufficient information to redirect his attention toward easier targets. She felt, for the first time since arriving in Kansas, genuinely settled. The first snow came on a Saturday evening in December. Not a brutal storm, but a quiet, steady snowfall that blanketed the prairie in an uninterrupted whiteness that transformed the landscape into something still and almost sacred. Margaret stood at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched it fall and felt the particular quality of peace that comes when you have fought something, and won, and now the world is simply beautiful and asks nothing of you for a moment. A knock at her door at 8 o'clock in the evening was unexpected. She opened it to find Benjamin standing in the snow with Thomas beside him, and the boy was holding what appeared to be a covered pan of something, which he extended toward her immediately. "Pa made soup," Thomas said. "He said you should not be alone your first snow." Margaret looked at Benjamin over Thomas's head. He was looking slightly past her shoulder in the way of a man who is aware that his son has said something very precise and cannot entirely disown it. "We were passing," Benjamin said. "You were not passing," Margaret said. "I am not on the way to anything." "We were not passing," he conceded. She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the snow, both of you." They sat at her kitchen table and ate the soup, which was excellent, a rich beef broth with root vegetables and herbs that spoke of a man who had learned to cook out of necessity and had then, somewhere along the way, actually learned to cook. Thomas ate his soup and then fell asleep with his head on the table in the easy way of children who have no self-consciousness about it, and Margaret moved quietly to bring a blanket from the back room. She and Benjamin sat across the table from each other in the lamplight, the snow still falling softly outside the window, the sleeping child between them making the kitchen feel full. "He is extraordinary," she said quietly, nodding at Thomas. "He is," Benjamin said. "He likes you considerably." "I like him considerably," she said. A pause. The lamp made a small sound. Outside, the snow fell on. "I should say something to you," Benjamin said. He was looking at his hands on the table, and then he looked up at her, and she braced herself for the weight of whatever was coming. "I know you have reasons to be careful," he said. "I know you have had experience of a kind that makes trust a costly thing. I am not asking you to trust me on the basis of anything except what I have actually done, which is the only honest offer I know how to make." He paused. "I do not want to be the man who makes things harder for you. If any of this," he made a small gesture that encompassed, she thought, the soup and the snow and the note and the well and all the months of quiet proximity. "If any of it is unwelcome, I would rather know." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight he was tired and earnest and slightly uncertain in a way that she found more moving than any polished declaration could have been, because the uncertainty was genuine. He was not certain of the outcome. He was asking. "It is not unwelcome," she said. "None of it." He looked at her. "I have been afraid of it," she said honestly. "That is different from unwelcoming it." "Yes," he said. "I know the difference." "I know you do," she said. "That is part of what makes it not unwelcome." The silence between them was charged now in a new way, and yet it was still somehow the comfortable kind, as if the honesty in the air made it easier to breathe. "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not Benjamin," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I have known from the beginning. You wrote it in your note." He looked at her with something in his face that was entirely undefended and entirely real, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned under hers and his fingers closed around her hand with a gentleness that made her throat tight. Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and shifted on the table, and they both looked at him, and then they looked at each other, and Margaret felt the full weight of what was happening, not frightening anymore, not dangerous, just true and present and good in the way of things that have been earned. "He would be glad about this," she said softly. "I know," Benjamin said. "He has been campaigning for it since about 2 days after you arrived. He told me your well rope was frayed wrong," she said. "He told me your gait was loose," he said. They both understood, simultaneously, that the boy had managed the entire opening sequence with the deliberate strategy of a 7-year-old who knew exactly what he was doing. "He gets it from his mother," Benjamin said. Margaret laughed softly, aware of the sleeping child, and Benjamin's hand tightened around hers, and outside the first snow of their first winter fell clean and quiet and unhurried on the Kansas prairie. Christmas came to Harlan's Creek with the practical, generous spirit of communities that understand celebration as a collective act of survival. The Dempsey gathering in December was larger than usual. Several families had traveled distances that would have seemed impossible in summer, but were managed in winter because the cold weather freed people from certain outdoor obligations, and because people needed each other more, or were more willing to admit that they did. The schoolhouse in Harlan's Creek, such as it was, a single room in a building that also served as a church on Sundays, had been cleared and decorated with pine boughs and candles, and whatever the assembled community had brought, and there was music and food, and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room together. Margaret stood with Benjamin through most of it and made no pretense otherwise, and the community registered this with the particular mixture of approval, curiosity, and knowing satisfaction that frontier communities brought to the romantic affairs of their members, which were followed with something approaching the intensity reserved in other contexts for sporting events. Hattie Reeves smiled at Margaret with an expression that said she had never had any doubt about this outcome. Old Pete Calloway played 3 extra songs when he noticed them dancing. They danced twice. Margaret had not danced in years. Gerald had not danced, had in fact regarded Margaret's enjoyment of dancing as a minor personal affront, and she had forgotten the particular pleasure of it, the straightforward physical joy of moving in time with music, and with another person who was paying full attention. Benjamin was not a particularly skilled dancer, which was fine because neither was she, but they paid attention to each other and that was sufficient, and then more than sufficient, and she laughed again, the way she had laughed in Selena, freely and without catching herself. Thomas danced with 3 different girls in succession, was declined by a 4th, considered this information briefly, and went back to eating cake. He was going to be an interesting man, Margaret thought, watching him. On the drive home through the cold December night, the stars extravagant overhead, Thomas asleep between them on the wagon seat, Margaret and Benjamin rode in silence for a while, and then she put her head against his shoulder, and he did not say anything at all, just put his arm around her, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the horses found their way home by instinct, and everything was precisely as it should be. January was hard in the way that Kansas Januaries always were, unrelenting, honest about their intentions, uninterested in sentiment. The temperature dropped to levels that made every outdoor task a negotiation between necessity and survival, and the days were short and the nights were long, and the work of keeping everything alive, the livestock, the pipes, the people, was constant. Margaret and Benjamin fell into the rhythm of the combined operation with a naturalness that surprised her less, she realized, than it might have surprised an earlier version of herself. He came to her property in the mornings to help with the cold weather chores that were most difficult alone, and she spent several evenings a week at the Chandler house, where the kitchen was larger and warmer, and where Thomas did his evening reading by lamplight, and reported his progress with the satisfaction of someone who understands that learning is its own reward. Thomas had decided, with considerable deliberateness, to teach Margaret chess. He had learned from Benjamin, who had in turn learned from his father, and he approached the pedagogical project with an intensity that Margaret found both exhausting and deeply charming. "The queen is the most powerful piece," Thomas told her on the first evening of instruction, "but most people forget that the bishops are the strategic key. Pa always says you should never underestimate the diagonal." Margaret glanced at Benjamin over Thomas's head. He was reading at the other end of the table and had the air of a man pretending not to have heard. "Sound advice," she said. "He says it applies to life too," Thomas said. "The threat you do not see coming directly at you is often less dangerous than the one working at an angle. Your son," Margaret said to Benjamin, "is a philosopher." "He is," Benjamin said, without looking up from his book. Margaret lost the chess game but found herself, at the end of the evening, thinking about diagonals and the nature of threats she had not seen coming directly at her, and whether the unexpected angles in her life had been threats or gifts, and concluding that it largely depended on the person executing the angle. In February, Benjamin asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony and without theater, which was consistent with everything else about him. They were standing at her fence line on a cold, clear morning, looking at a section that needed attention in the spring, and he said, "I think you should marry me." And she turned and looked at him, and he was looking at the fence with the slightly concentrated expression of a man who is aware he is being somewhat more direct than he normally operates. "You think I should," she repeated. I do, he said. He looked at her then. I think it would be good for the properties and good for Thomas and good for you and considerably good for me. And I know that is not a particularly romantic argument, but I have some feelings I have not entirely put into sentences yet, and I thought the practical case was stronger ground while I worked on that. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. What are the feelings you have not put into sentences? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence. Then he looked at her again, and his expression was entirely open, no guard in it, no calculation, no performance. Just the truth of him, standing in the cold February air, asking for the one thing he had declared in his note that he would not ask for. I think you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a long time, he said. I think about you when you are not there, and when you are there I feel that things are better than they would be otherwise, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life with you being my neighbor when I could have you be my wife. That is the feeling I was working on. Margaret felt the warmth of it move through her entirely, from the center outward, like sunlight through clear water. She thought about all the ways she had been afraid of this, and all the ways the fear had been legitimate, and all the ways this man had, over months of quiet and consistent and entirely honest action, rendered that specific fear obsolete. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, Benjamin, she said. I think you should marry me too. The smile that moved across his face was unlike the small, contained version she had seen before. It was full and genuine, and transformed him into someone she had not quite seen before but recognized immediately, the way you recognize the full form of something you have only glimpsed in pieces. He stepped forward and kissed her, there at the fence line in the cold February air, and it was neither desperate nor cautious but something perfectly between those things, warm and sure and real. Thomas, who had apparently been watching from the kitchen window, knocked on the glass 3 times in approval. They were married in the Harlan's Creek schoolhouse on the 1st of April, 1874, on a day that began cold and cleared into brilliant sunshine by mid-morning, as if the weather had decided to make an effort. The whole of the small community attended, which was not surprising given that the whole of the small community had been paying close attention to the development of this particular story since September, when Margaret had come down the road in her wagon and Benjamin had looked up from his fence with the attentive expression of a man who had just noticed something significant. Hattie Reeves organized the food with the comprehensive authority of a general conducting a campaign. Old Pete Calloway played at the reception until his fingers gave out. Thomas Chandler wore a new shirt that he had permitted Margaret to buy for him in Salina, and stood beside his father during the ceremony with the serious, composed dignity of a boy who understands that some moments require a certain quality of attention. The circuit preacher, a cheerful Methodist named Reverend Cole who rode a circuit that covered 400 square miles, performed the ceremony with the brisk warmth of a man who had presided over weddings in difficult conditions before, and was genuinely pleased when the circumstances were pleasant. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Eliza had sent from Lawrence, a deep blue wool that Hattie Reeves said made her look like someone who had always been exactly where she was. Benjamin wore his best coat and a clean shirt, and looked at Margaret through the entire ceremony with the same unhurried, attentive expression he brought to everything, and she looked back at him with the full weight of her own clear-eyed, hard-won, freely given heart. After the ceremony, Thomas informed them both formally that he considered the day to be a net improvement on the available alternatives and that he was glad they had gotten to this point before he had to be more direct about his intentions to facilitate it. "We know about the fence and the well," Margaret said. Thomas looked momentarily surprised, then composed himself. "Those were genuine repairs," he said. "They were," Margaret agreed. "Thank you," he considered. "You are welcome," he said, and the slight formality of it made her laugh and hug him, and he allowed it with the dignified tolerance of a boy who has decided he can afford to be gracious. The 2 properties were merged into a single operation the following spring. It was not a simple process, combining two distinct landholdings with their respective herds. Equipment, infrastructure, and legal documentation required months of careful work. But Margaret and Benjamin approached it with the same methodical honesty they brought to everything else. And by late summer, it was a unified operation of approximately 600 acres running both cattle and a modest but productive kitchen garden and orchard. With a hay operation that made them largely self-sufficient through the hard winters. The house was the Chandler house, which was larger and more solidly built, though they made significant additions and improvements over the first 2 years. Margaret's farmhouse, the one she had arrived at in September of 1873, became a well-maintained secondary structure on the property, used for storage, and eventually for a use she could not have anticipated in those early days. Thomas, who was 8 now, and who had taken to the combined household with the adaptability of a child, who had always understood instinctively that family was something you built rather than something that simply happened to you, spent the summer following the wedding teaching Margaret to ride properly. She had managed adequately before, but Thomas had strong opinions about what adequately actually meant, and conducting an extended campaign to convince his father that the operation needed a dog. Benjamin's position on the dog question was thoughtful and measured. Thomas's position was absolute. The dog arrived in the form of a border collie puppy obtained from Eric Voss, who raised them for cattle work. Thomas named him Franklin, which he said was a presidential name, and therefore appropriate for a dog expected to perform responsible duties. Franklin was ferociously intelligent and immediately attached himself to Thomas with an intensity that made it apparent he had also made this choice deliberately. Margaret watched all of it, the boy and the dog and the man who had been her neighbor and was now her husband, the way the long golden light of the Kansas summer moved across the land. She had come to love with the specific love that comes from having worked it, from having fought for it, from having chosen it over all the easier alternatives. And she felt a quality of peace and fullness that she had not believed was available to her in those early months when she had been afraid of wanting anything. In November of 1874, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Benjamin on a quiet evening after Thomas had gone to bed, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that moved through several things she could track: surprise, something profound and unhurried that was clearly joy, a question. "You are well," he said. "I am very well," she said. He took her hands in his and held them and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing required. "Thomas will be beside himself," he said eventually. "Thomas has been suggesting it for months," she said. He used different vocabulary, but the thrust was clear. Benjamin laughed, which was still, even now after months of it, one of her favorite things in the world. "He did mention to me in August that our household had considerable untapped capacity," he said. "He is diplomatic," she said. "He is strategic," Benjamin said. "He always has been." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and Margaret approached it with the same methodical attention she brought to all things, asking sensible questions of the community's nearest midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Halcott, who traveled between homesteads and had delivered half the children in the surrounding county. Thomas took a calm, systematic interest in the project and declared early on that he would like a brother, but that a sister would also be acceptable provided she was not the kind of sister who was afraid of things. "What kind of things?" Margaret asked. "Spiders," Thomas said, "and weather and work." "Those seem like reasonable standards," Margaret said. "Pa agrees," Thomas said. The baby was born in July of 1875. A boy, arriving in the morning like a reasonable person, as Hattie Reeves said afterward, with dark hair like his father and blue-gray eyes that Margaret said recalled her own mother. They named him William James Chandler, Will for daily use, a name that felt solid and honest and full of possibility. Thomas greeted his brother with the controlled enthusiasm of a boy who had been patient for 9 years, and was now ready to have a project, and held him with the careful, deliberate gentleness of someone who understood the weight and fragility of the thing in his arms. Benjamin stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched his wife and his sons in the July morning light, with an expression that he had stopped trying to contain some time ago, an expression of the deep, uncomplicated love of a man whose life had turned out to contain things he had not allowed himself to expect. He walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside Margaret, and she leaned against him and made the particular exploratory sounds of a very new person discovering the world's basic parameters, and Thomas sat on the other side of the bed and held his brother's very small hand with complete seriousness. "He has good hands," Thomas said. "Look at the grip." "That is important." "It is," Benjamin agreed. "For riding," Thomas said, "and for fence work and for things generally." "For things generally," Benjamin said. Margaret looked at her husband and he looked at her over the heads of their sons, and she thought about a September afternoon 2 years ago when she had stood in the doorway of a small, weathered farmhouse and read a note that had said everything important in 11 words. Not a demand. Not a performance of generosity designed to extract something in return. Just the clean, true record of a man who had done a thing because it needed doing and offered it without conditions. The well is fixed. The gate swings true. And I ask for nothing. She had understood eventually what the note was really saying. Not just about the well, not just about the gate. It was a declaration of character, a demonstration of the kind of man he was in the way only demonstration can demonstrate a thing, not by announcement, not by testimony, but by action taken in silence and offered without obligation. It was, she thought, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, precisely because it had not been said as romance. It had been said as fact. She had come to Kansas frightened and determined and wearing her caution like armor, and she had found the land honest as advertised and the community mostly fair, and she had found Benjamin Chandler, who was both of those things and considerably more. She put her hand over his where it rested on the blanket and felt his fingers close around hers, and looked at the window where the July sun was coming through strong and warm, and full of the particular quality of light that meant another good day in the life she had built from the open materials of her own courage and his quiet faithfulness. Outside, Franklin, the border collie, was doing something constructive in the yard. The cattle grazed on the east pasture. The well, her well, their well, on land that was now fully and irrevocably theirs, turned with the smooth efficiency of something built to last, the rope clean and strong, the mechanism well maintained, the bucket coming up with water from the deep, honest earth of the Kansas territory. The gate stood square in its posts at the front of the property, the hinges true, the latch sound, the way clear for whatever came next. 2 years later, the property had grown to nearly 800 acres, the result of a careful purchase of an adjacent parcel from a homesteader moving further west, and the cattle operation had expanded accordingly. Benjamin had hired 2 ranch hands brothers from Ohio, named Cal and Pete Hargrove, good workers with the uncomplicated reliability of men who preferred straightforward tasks to complicated situations. And the scale of the operation had shifted from survival to genuine prosperity. Thomas, now 10, had become an indispensable figure in the daily operations of the ranch, with a particular skill for managing the horses that Ben Aldrich at the Salina livery said was the best natural horsemanship he had seen in 20 years of looking at it. Thomas had also developed, over the preceding year, an apparently irresistible magnetic pull toward books, which Margaret had done everything in her power to encourage, ordering volumes from the bookseller in Salina, writing to Eliza for recommendations, ensuring that the evening reading sessions she had established in the household continued even when the days were long and the work was heavy. Will, at 2, was beginning the vocal phase of his development with impressive commitment, producing an ongoing running commentary on everything in his environment that Thomas described, accurately, as extremely useful data. Franklin the dog had appointed himself Will's permanent guardian and followed him everywhere with the serious professional attention of a dog who has identified his primary purpose and intends to fulfill it completely. Margaret had, somewhere in the course of these years, become a central figure in the community of Harlan's Creek in ways she had not anticipated when she first arrived. Her practical competence and her history of dealing effectively with Harlan Breck, who had, as predicted, not disappeared, but had relocated his more aggressive activities to a more vulnerable area, had established her as someone to consult when legal or organizational problems arose. She had helped Clara Voss when Eric died of an accident on their property in the spring of 1875, navigating the legal and practical dimensions of widowhood with the knowledge of someone who had been there and survived it. She had helped young Annie Stokes, newly arrived from Missouri in the spring of 1876, understand what her options were when her husband had turned out to be the kind of man Annie had not fully seen before she married him. She did all of this with the same methodical compassion she brought to everything, and she felt, in doing it, that she was not simply paying back the kindness she had received in her early months in Kansas, but participating in something larger, the ongoing collective project of making this rough, honest country a place where people could live with dignity. Hattie Reeves told her, at the October gathering in 1876, that she was the kind of woman the territory needed more of. Margaret thanked her and said she thought the same of Hattie, which was also true. Eliza came to visit in the summer of 1876, her first visit since Margaret had arrived in Kansas, and spent 2 weeks on the property being a complete and unapologetic delight, which was Eliza's primary mode of operation. She adored Thomas immediately, found Will hilarious, and assessed Benjamin with the focused attention of a woman who had been worrying about her cousin for years and needed to evaluate the situation for herself. Her assessment, delivered to Margaret on the third day, was, "He looks at you like you are the best thing that has happened to him in a considerable time, and you look at him the same way, and I am enormously relieved." "I thought you would not be subtle about it," Margaret said. "I am never subtle," Eliza said. "I lack the gene. Do you love him?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. Completely, she said. "It is nothing like what I thought I knew before. It is," she paused, looking for the word. "It is quiet," she said. "It is the kind of love that does not require performance. It just is." Eliza was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough to be notable. "Good," she said finally. "That is the right kind." In October of 1876, Margaret discovered she was expecting again. She told Benjamin on a cold, clear morning while they were feeding the horses, and he put down the feed bucket and looked at her with the full warmth of a man who has not lost the capacity to be moved by the things that matter, and said, "Are you happy?" "Enormously," she said. He smiled, the full, open smile, still her favorite sight in the world, and pulled her into his arms, and she leaned into him with the complete, unguarded ease of a woman who has forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of being held. Thomas, informed at dinner, received the news with characteristic thoroughness. He had several questions about timing and logistics, acknowledged that Will's ongoing development would provide useful preparation for a new sibling, and stated that he would be glad of either a brother or a sister as long as previously established, the sister was not the type to be afraid of spiders or weather or work. "She will not be," Margaret assured him. He said. Margaret considered. "Or he," she said. Thomas nodded. "Either is acceptable," he said. "As previously established." The baby arrived in the early summer of 1877, a girl this time, healthy and vigorous and possessed, from her very first hours in the world, of a quality of alert attention that Mrs. Halcott said she had not seen in a newborn since Thomas, who had been famous in the community for looking around the room with the focused intensity of someone taking notes. They named her Clara Ann Chandler, Clara for the neighbor who had needed a friend at the hardest moment of her life, Anne for Margaret's mother. Thomas held her with the same serious precision he had brought to holding Will, and declared, after careful examination, that she met all previously established standards. Will patted her head with the expansive generosity of a 2-year-old who is not entirely sure what is happening, but is broadly in favor of it. Franklin the dog inspected her with professional thoroughness and extended his protective jurisdiction to include her without apparent hesitation. Benjamin sat that evening at the kitchen table with Clara in his arms, Will on his lap attempting to feed a piece of bread to the baby, Thomas reading at the other end of the table with Franklin's head on his feet, and Margaret across from him with a cup of tea and the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman whose life has turned out to be better than anything she had dared to design. He looked at her over the heads of their children. "You are happy," he said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of thing you say when you want to hear the answer spoken aloud because you want it in the air between you. "I am happy," she said. "I am very happy, Benjamin." He looked at her with his dark, attentive eyes, and she saw everything in them. The 9 years he had built this place alone, the 3 years of grief, the careful solitude he had maintained until she had come down the road in her wagon and something had shifted in the landscape of his attention. She saw all the mornings he had come to her fence without announcement, and all the notes he had not written except the one, and the one was enough because it had said everything essential. "So am I," he said. Clara made a sound of mild commentary on the world. Will laughed at it. Thomas looked up from his book with a smile that was entirely his father's, unhurried, real, arriving without announcement. Outside, the Kansas summer moved through its long golden evening. The cattle were settled in the pasture. The horses were fed. The well turned smoothly, its rope clean and strong, lifting good water from deep, honest earth. The gate stood square and true in the fence line, the hinges set clean, the latch sound, the way open in both directions. Margaret Chandler, who had come to this country carrying nothing but a clean deed and a dark past, and the stubborn intention to be someone other than afraid, sat in her kitchen in the lamplight and looked at her husband and her children and her life, and she felt the full, clear, uncomplicated weight of it, the hard one, freely given, entirely real truth of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been left a note that asked for nothing. She had brought a pie. And all the rest had followed from that, honest and true and unstoppable as water finding its way to the deep places of the earth where everything grows. She picked up Clara from Benjamin's arms and held her daughter and looked at her husband and her sons and the window full of summer evening, and she thought that the bravest thing she had ever done was not fighting Harlan Breck or riding to Salina or crossing the Missouri state line with her wagon and her deed and her determination. The bravest thing she had ever done was walking up that road in September with an apple pie in her hands and her heart, very carefully, beginning to open its hands. Everything else had been consequence, beautiful, irreversible, perfect consequence. The lamp burned low. The children were put to bed, Will with his ceremonial protest and rapid defeat by sleep, Thomas with his book and his philosophical final observation of the evening, Clara with the complete animal trust of a very small person who has no reason yet to believe the world is anything other than safe. Franklin took his position by the door with professional commitment. Margaret and Benjamin sat together in the quiet of the kitchen after the house was still, the way they often did, with no particular agenda except the pleasure of being in the same room without anything being required. He had a cup of coffee. She had her tea. The window showed the stars coming out over the prairie, the particular extravagance of a clear summer night in Kansas. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know?" he asked. She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "I know everything I need. I just like hearing you answer." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that still, even now, 3 years into this, surrounded by evidence of everything they had built together, undid her completely. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "All right," he said. The summer night moved around them, alive and endless, and the Kansas stars turned slowly overhead, and Benjamin Chandler held his wife's hand in the lamplight of a kitchen full of everything that matters, And the land outside was honest, and the water was good, and the gate swung true, and the way ahead was open and clear, all the way to the horizon and beyond.